それでは皆様。
Good afternoon. We would like to resume JIIA Open Symposium, looking back at Asia in the 20th century from the perspective of international relations and state building. This is part 2, state and region building in East Asia, the examples of South Korea, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. Professor Takahara, the University of Tokyo, as a moderator, and presenters are Professor Kim, Dongguk University, and Professor KIMIYA, the University of Tokyo, Professor of University of Tokyo, and Professor KURATA, Rikkyo University, Professor CHANG, Associate Research Fellow, Institute of Taiwan History, Academia, Sinica. Please come forward. Good afternoon. We would like to start the part 2 session. According to Professor Tanaka, we talk about internal equilibrium, and especially the first part is Northeast Asia. We focus on Northeast Asia, and the last session is on the Southeast Asia. Guessing from the speeches in the first session, I think it's better to go to reports quickly without me saying anything extra. So I would like to invite Professor Kim of Dongguk University and South Korea Economic Growth, Comparisons with Taiwan, Japan, and the U.S. That's the title. His background is in the program, so please refer to it. I would not go into his background explanation. My title is South Korean Economic Growth in Comparison with Taiwan, Japan, and the U.S. First, the research issue. The reports we heard in the morning, and also Professor KIMIYA's report, divide the history into different eras, but in my report, I would like to take a diachronic approach to the history of Asia, South Korea. And I would like to use quantitative indicators to show long-term changes in 100 years. I would like to show the continuity and discontinuity. And we can use long-term statistics of Taiwan, Japan, and the USA. So I would like to compare those three countries. And I would like to show the characteristics of East Asia's economic growth. And I think this sort of research will provide some sort of suggestions to research questions. Why rapid growth happened in South Korea and East Asia? I think I can give some sort of answer to this question. And what were the factors involved in the rapid economic growth? Was it specific to each country, or was it shared by and common in East Asia? And does this rapid growth be sustainable or not? My report consists of 3. First, I talked about system or regime changes and economic institutions. That's the first part. Second part is economic growth, catch-up, and capital formation of physical and human capital. And the third point is growth and income distribution. So, first, regime changes and economic institutions. In my research, I think there were three regime changes was the critical juncture. First was colonialized, and we were actually part of the regional integration. And then a wartime command economy, and then liberation and division. But the time is limited, so I would like to talk about the critical juncture of South Korea. First is the annexation of Korea, and also the Sino-Japanese War and the liberation. And Japan took assimilation policy when it annexed Korea. And when we look at the content of the assimilation, we used the same yen-pegged currency, which is Chonsun yen, and also abolition of duties, and transplanting civil code and other legal code. So there was a regional integration. So this is similar to the EU integration. Of course, in case of the EU, each country actually waived its economic sovereignty voluntarily, but in case of Korea, it was forced. But because of this assimilation policy, Korea was part of the East Asian regional integration, and this triggered various changes. This was one critical juncture. And from the Sino-Japanese War of 1937, actually a command economy system was in place because of the wartime. Then a liberation, and when it was liberated, the North Korea did not succeed the systems at the time of assimilation, whereas South Korea, we actually continued to use the legal system at the time of assimilation policy by Japan. So there was a continuity of economic system in case of South Korea, and it also regained economic sovereignty. So it took it actually implemented industrial policies. So and I would like to show quantitatively what sort of changes happened in a long period of time. These are actually prices. This is Korea, Japan, and USA. You can see this is GDP deflator, but you can see they are prices. This is a log memory. So 9 times or 10 times, you have to multiply by 10 times. But there's a Korean War. And Taiwan, prices have been stable. But in case of Korea, there's a very sharp slope. This means there's a increase of prices rather rapidly in Korea. Before the war, 4 lines moved in line, but there's a change after the war. And what about the opening of the market? This is the average duty rate. So duty amount divided by import amount. So this shows to what extent the market is open. And this is Korea, Taiwan, Japan, and USA in that order. When it was liberated, the average duty rate was 5%. This was forced by the unequal treaty. And because of colonialization, the duty rate came down, but it went up after the liberation. And it was true with other independent countries because there was nationalistic movement. In case of East Asia, it came down. So we went back to open market system rather quickly. Now, I talked about the economic institutions and systems, but how can we measure the quality of the systems? For example, protection of property rights. If that is well protected, that means it's a high quality system. And I use contract intensive money as one indicator to show this quality. There's a cash and there's a deposit money. If instead of using deposit currency, if we use more cash currency, that means if we use more cash, that means that trust in the economic institutions is low. It's kind of, this is USA. If it's close to 1, it's stable. This is Japan and Taiwan and Korea. During colonialization, it went up, but after the liberation and after the Korean War, it kind of became flat. It is difficult to show the quality of institutions in numbers, but this is just one suggestion. This is about the system or institutions, but the second point is catch-up process and capital formation. In this USA is 100%. This is Japan, Taiwan, and Korea. This is per capita GDP to show the income level. Before the war, Japan's was 30% of the USA, and Korea less than 10%. But after the war, there's a widening of disparity. We're now close to 70%. We use PPP, purchasing power parity, and Taiwan is exceeding that of Japan, but this shows the changes. What is the international comparative advantage in the catch-up process? If it's over 0, you have advantage. If it's below 0, you have disadvantage. In 1960s or before 1960s, primary industry was competitive, but manufacturing did not have a competitive edge, but this was reversed. And in 1990s, machinery had a competitive edge. So industrial structure was more sophisticated and the technology was more advanced. In case of Japan, in 1960s, machinery industry had a competitive advantage, and in case of Korea, there's several tens of years of lag. So you can why catching up was possible? because there was a faster formation of physical capital. This is Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and dotted line is France and USA. When we look at East Asia, it was over 30%, and this is exceptional. There was a rapid growth of this formation of physical capital, and this is an investment rate. What is the ratio of investment in the GDP? And saving rates went up as well. So investment rate and the savings rate increased quite rapidly. And how was it possible? And in relation to this issue, I can see demography, change of population structure. We say we're in the aging society in Japan as well. Actually, productive age population has been increasing. So there was a time that the Korea enjoyed the population bonus, but now it is the red one is the number of productive age people, but this will decline from now on. In case of the aged, or people or children 0 to 14, from 1970s it started to decrease. So total dependency rate, in other words, children under 14 and elderly over 65 years old, increase. So it's a U-shaped. It came down, but up until 2065 it will increase quite rapidly. So when total dependency rate was low, it was the era of population bonus, and from now on we will face a population onus. Actually, the working age, productive age people increase. That could happen in any country, but for that to result in higher savings rate, they have to find employment. So employment rate has been quite high in Korea. Working age people increased and they had jobs and they started to save. So I'm talking about Korea, but what about Taiwan and Japan? Though there's a time lag, there was a similar movement. Red one is Korea. This is total dependency rate. And Taiwan had the same sort of movement. And Japan, it's U-shaped, but it started faster than Korea and Taiwan. And it started to increase earlier than, maybe 20 years earlier than Korea and Taiwan in terms of total dependency rate. So this is the time that there was a high economic growth, and now we are in this rather low growth period. And we're in a difficult times for growth. I think that's one of the characteristics of East Asia. I talked about the physical capital, but this is human capital formation. Accumulation of human capital. This is the schooling years. This is USA, Japan, and Taiwan, and Korea. Before the war, there was an increase. In the USA, there was an increase of accumulation of human resources, and Japan lagged. But after the war, there was a rapid catch-up. And there was a rapid accumulation of human capital. In changing demography, people had fewer numbers. In other words, there was a trade-off of quality and quantity of children. In case of Korea, they had fewer children, but they invested more on education of fewer numbers of children. That's what they selected. So, accumulation of human resource formation and higher savings rate were actually interconnected. Because of the liberation, those were the factors which supported the rapid growth after the liberation. Now, growth and income distribution. This is the top 1%'s concentration of income in top 1%. This is US, this is Korea, Taiwan, Japan, and France. After the war, 10 to 20% of the income was in the hands of top 1%. But it went down after the war, and from 1980s in the USA, it went up to the same level as before the war. Japan, it is increasing a bit, but it has maintained similar number from the. But Taiwan and Korea, it's getting closer to the pattern of the USA. In other words, concentration of income in top 1%. I would not explain the factors, reasons behind because of the time constraint. I hope you will look at my resume. We compared just top 1%, the concentration of income. What about the earned income? Income distribution of workers. If we take USA as 100%, and we compare Japan and Korea. This is top 10% and this is top 20%. Top 0.01%. Real rich one. In case of Japan and Korea, if US is 100, top 0.01% has Japan and Korea 1/5 of that of USA in terms of concentration. So middle income and the lower income people, distribution to those people in Japan is higher. In Korea, the top one is getting closer to Japan, but the bottom one is actually there's more discrepancy. In other words, higher income people enjoy higher distribution of income, but not the lower one. So in terms of region, I showed actually institutions, growth and distribution from a longer term perspective, and the colonial period, and after liberation to 1960 and high growth period, and the economic growth of Korea is sharing legacy, sharing legacy of Japan. Of course, we paid enormous sacrifice because of the war, because the country was divided into two, but in East Asia, though there's a time lag, there's a similar demographic change, and this resulted in acceleration of growth and stagnation.
Thank you very much. Using a lot of data, rich data within a short period of time, excellently. The development in countries over the last 100 years was explained. Next, I would like to invite Professor Tadashi KIMIYA, who's going to talk about the evolution of state building in Korea, competition over de-colonization, regime competition via the entrepreneurial state, transformation into an advanced industrialized economy during the post-regime competition period. I think I have covered part of what he's going to say already. Professor KIMIYA, please. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity for presentation. The title is very long, so I think you can see what I'm going to say from the title. Earlier this year, nationalism, from this perspective of nationalism, the 20th century, of course, from the end of 19th century to early 20th century, the Korean Peninsula overview to be drawn. That is something that I wrote about in my book. And in this thesis, how state was built and how that changed from this viewpoint. I would like to cover the end of 19th century to early 20th century. Rather than the overall Korean Peninsula, but I would like to focus on South Korea and as compared to North Korea, which I also try to cover to look at it from the viewpoint of state building. Also, this is the prehistory, and so through this prehistory, decolonization and the competition, the regime competition between North and South, and in the regime competition, South Korea took an advantage, and South Korea became an advanced economy. So from these three stages, we would like to look at the development of Korean Peninsula, and that is the purpose of this paper. And so with respect to prehistory, in the case of Korea, this is often mentioned, the Joseon dynasty period, and around the same time, the Edo period. These two are often compared, and there is some sort of a paradox. And the centralized regime was in Joseon dynasty, and to the demand for opening, they resisted. It was possible for Korea to resist it, but as a result, however, the timing of opening was delayed. In the case of Japan, toward the end of the Edo period, and because of Meiji Restoration, there was some sort of a change of government. There was some change of regime because of a centralized regime that happened, and the centralized system was achieved for modernization. But in the case of Korea, it was delayed. So there was this kind of paradoxical comparison that can be drawn. And second point is the Japanese colonial rule. Well, of course, this was a rule by a different nation. Well, because Japanese people migrated to Korea, and centering around Japan, there was some sort of international division of labor, and Korea was brought into it. So the colonial management was the main concept. Of course, there was a violent nature of colonial rule. It was there simply, but aloof from the society. The colonial state was an entrepreneurial state. By this I mean the going beyond the dichotomy of entrepreneur and ship. The state contributed greatly to the development of corporations, and that's the role played by the state. And so this kind of a role was played. And this is one of the characteristics of Korea at that time. So I would like to go into the main part of my presentation. So the first stage is the decolonization. And here, number one, the colonial state, the Korean Peninsula, both North and South experienced the decolonization. And what was the legacy that was passed on? And because it's a decolonization, this was elimination of colonial rule. So these are the two issues that faced the Korean Peninsula, and what kind of state building happened. And one important point here is the independence occurred overnight, didn't occur overnight. So the North Korea, South Korea experienced the rule, the occupation by the Russia and the U.S. And under the occupation, the constitution came about. However, of course, the period was short, and in both cases, North and South, some sort of minimum the entrepreneur state role was played, and this was quite limited. And after that, it was divided, and of course, there was a war. And after the war, South Korea and North Korea, which over the decolonization was more successful. So there was a competition between North and South. At least in 1950s, up until 1950s, this is just a relative point, but compared with South Korea, North Korea, in terms of economic performance, was superior. And so in this kind of regime competition, South Korea is overwhelmingly at an advantage right now. Why wasn't it the case before? So this is a relative point. Compared with the state, in South Korea, in the Lee Soo-man administration, this party, a political party, was at a higher position because it was a party state. So for North Korea, it was similar in this respect. But to achieve economic growth, rather than the benefit of the state, the benefit of the party trumped. And because of that, the economic policy itself, of course, for decarbonization, the state capitalism was adopted, but the import substitution, industrialization, the ruling party's benefit trumped the benefit of the state. So that's one point that I can point out. Secondly, in connection with the external world, what sort of relationship should it have? Well, since we're talking about decolonization, the traditional division of labor, going back to the traditional division, this was rejected. However, on the other hand, such external resources need to be exploited. Otherwise, decolonization or modernization would not be achieved successfully. So that there was this limitation. And in the second stage, so from 1960s thereafter, here, a major change is in South Korea, the entrepreneurial state was established to a great extent, and the entrepreneurs under the entrepreneurial state, the export oriented and the import substitution policies were adopted to achieve a great performance. And vis-a-vis North Korea, in economic performance, there was a major difference, the gap that was achieved. However, did it go smoothly? Again, in 1961, there was a coup, and the Park Chung-hee administration came into being. Under Park Chung-hee administration, the policies taken had a lot of trials and errors, at least at the beginning, more or less. The state capitalist oriented economic policy was pursued, but this was not very successful. And also in connection with the U.S., applied a brake, and the South Korea government itself, this is a pragmatic attitude of Park Chung-hee administration. But the initial policy was corrected immediately, and the government led, rather than government led, but private sector led, with the government support, such an entrepreneurial state was pursued, and through the export-oriented industrialization, the economic growth was achieved, and also, and that was supported by foreign policy. In Isuman, the foreign relationship was not very much used for economic development, but under the Park Chung-hee administration, the external resources was maximized, tried to be maximized, and not to erode the independence or autonomy of South Korea. The balance between the two was pursued. For example, in connection with Japan, the normalization of diplomatic relations and economic assistance was given by, so this maximization of resources and was underlined, and also vis-a-vis the U.S. in this period, it was a Cold War era, so a contribution to the U.S. But in return for that, the resource maximization and optimization was pursued. In the 1970s, for the development of heavy industries, well, the international relationship was centered around China, and also involvement of the U.S. became rather vague. So for Park Chung-hee administration, rather than the relationship with the external world, they underlined the autonomy in both economy and also in security. And that was a priority, but still, as a result, in terms of the politics, there was this the Yushin regime, and the entrepreneurial nature was maintained. Of course, the heavy industry, the chemical industry orientation, the nationalist logic was used, which may not be in line with the industrialization, but by harmonizing the two conflicting policies, they moved ahead with industrialization, heavy industrialization and chemical industrialization. And beyond the Park Chung-hee administration, this was passed on to Chun Doo-hwan. But in 1980s, the heavy industrialization in the 1970s, that the economic distortion, the market mechanism, well, the distortion away from with the economic stability, it was corrected. That kind of a change was witnessed. So after 1960s until 80s, this continued. And the entrepreneurial state of South Korea allowed South Korea to have an advantage in post-regime competition. What were the conditions that allowed it to do so? I think the policy decision-making had more autonomy. In a democratic country, political change, or along with the change of government, the consistency of policy may be difficult to maintain. But under the Park Chung-hee administration in South Korea, 18 years without any change of government occurred, and policy decision autonomy, the consistency was achieved. And it is not just autonomy of the bureaucracy, but the bureaucracy's the autonomy and also the consistency of policies. South Korea has a presidency system, and in 1960s and 70s, Park Chung-hee was a very strong president of a strong cash secret, and president secured it, and this element was very important. And next, why did South Korea become different from North Korea? Now, of course, the commonality is the colonial legacy. But in state building, what were the difference between the two countries? In the case of South Korea, the society, or rather than the society or party, the state was prioritized. But in North Korea, because of socialism under the state system, the the objective or benefit of the state, well, the party or the individual or the ruler, was prioritized, and external collaboration, how to take advantage of that. On this point, the South Korea strengthened relationship with the outside world to maximize and optimize the external resources, and they tried to take advantage of it. In the case of North Korea, they were not able to do so, and that led to asymmetrical relationship between North and South Korea. And lastly, I would like to talk about South Korea development into an advanced economy in post-regime competition, and after the end of a Cold War. In terms of regime competition, the winner was decided. Asymmetrical North-South relationship was established. As a result, North Korea emphasized the relationship with the U.S., but South Korea underlined the North-South relationship. So the North thinking about the framework and the South concept of the framework were different. Another point is in the case of South Korea, under entrepreneurial state, they achieved economic growth. But after that, for the country to develop into an advanced economy, major challenge was faced. One of them is the democratization of the state, the political regime. There used to be an entrepreneurial state under the authoritarian regime, but they had to achieve an entrepreneurial state under democratic regime. Another point is the global economy became further globalized, and the state involvement in economy, that was no longer permissible. And that is another element that the state South Korea faced. And from 1997 to 98, there was an Asian currency crisis, and South Korea faced that. But to the Asian currency crisis, South Korea, I think, in a way, a political response was made. It just so happened that in this period, the conservatism to liberalism, there was a change of government at that time. And Kim Il-sung to Kim Dae-jung regime, there was a transition. And in Kim Dae-jung, and also under the Roh Moo-hyung administration, originally some sort of, it's a liberal, so social democratic, labor-employer harmony was pursued, but as opposed to that, they moved ahead with neoliberal reform, which is in contrast to their original concept. So the policy that was contrary to their thinking was pursued in order to avoid the Asian currency crisis. And that alleviated the reaction to the neoliberal reform and minimized the expenses cost. But then that led to major cost of further major expansion of non-regular employment. And with respect to South Korea, they have a declining birth rate and aging society. But in the case of South Korea, the welfare state had to be re-established, which was neglected before. But whether a welfare state can be created through the entrepreneurial state stance. This entails difficulties, and right now there is a political conflict between the conservatism and liberalism, and there is also a generational conflict between the old and the young. Lastly, in South Korea, when you look at the state building, I believe South Korea, I think some sort of a moralistic value is to be created. I think there's a high expectation on that in South Korea. However, if you look at the history, it was a colonial state, And also after independence, there was a state under the authoritarianism, and so there was a limited collaboration with the society, and so this expectation was damped to some extent. But with democratization, the unity between the state and the society through democratization will heighten the expense. But with the higher the expectation, there is a limit to about what the state can do. And so the social the success experience, it was so the dramatic successes of North Korea's entrepreneurial state may serve to highlight current issues facing the state. With that, I would like to conclude my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor KIMIYA. Entrepreneurial state. This is a very impressive concept to explain the history of Korea and development of Korea. So military was the one who actually shouldered this entrepreneurial state first, and chaebol, which was one of the results, and the civil society, who is quite active in Korea. So those new neo-actors, what sort of roles they'll play in the entrepreneurial state is an interesting perspective. I would like to ask him questions later. Now, we talked about South Korea, and from two commentators, they speak from a different perspective. First, Professor KURATA Toru of Rikkyo University, who is a Hong Kong specialist. My name is KURATA, thank you. Yes, I was, as introduced, contemporary politics of Hong Kong is what I specialize in. And Professor Kim and Professor KIMIYA, thank you very much for your reports on Korea, on economy and politics of South Korea. I do not have sufficient knowledge, so I am a bit concerned that I might not be able to give good comments on two reports. But I was asked to be a commentator for this session. The reason is Hong Kong and Korea were actually characterized as needs in Asia. Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and what called Four Dragons.
されたということがあったわけでございます。
However, when we try to compare Hong Kong and Korea, though they belong to Asian needs, they have some common thread, but there are differences in conditions. For example, colonial rule, from that perspective, Professor Kim said colonial rule by Japan had some similarity with Hong Kong, with Taiwan and Korea, but Hong Kong was ruled by the British, and of course Japan was occupied, but for a very short period of time. Hong Kong was occupied also by Japan, but for a short period of time, but it was mainly the UK. And Korea had sufficient number of population and surface area to be a state, and Singapore and Hong Kong are cities actually. There's no lack of farmland, and also no problem of distribution of income to the countryside. And looking at the politics, 80s and 90s, and there was popularization in ROK and Taiwan, but Hong Kong does not have democracy yet. And Korea and Taiwan, there was a high-tech industrialization, and it has a competitive edge. But Hong Kong and Singapore's edge is on finance. So those four Asian needs, Korea and Taiwan in one group, and Hong Kong and Singapore in another group. We can divide them into two different groups. And of course, there's a diversity of countries in Asian East, but outside of Asian East, there's ASEAN and China. A very impressive economic growth was achieved in those countries. And for 97, 98, there was an Asian crisis. And the theory of Asian needs actually lost its power. As Professor Tanaka said, the theory of Japan as an exception in Asia also lost its meaning. Having said so, if we can compare today, we can find some commonality. For example, in East Asia, per capita GDP, Japan and Asian needs are the ones who have reached the advanced country level GDP per capita. And for example, aging and decline of growth and distribution and how to cope with the rise of China. So similar issues and challenges those countries are facing. So if maybe we need a new Asia needs theory in reviewing the 20th century Asia. Now, from Hong Kong's vantage point, I would like to ask questions, one question to each speaker. To Professor Kim, Korea and Taiwan and Japan, you have used domestic economic statistics for 100 years. You have analyzed and compared and then talked about the diachronic history of Korea. It was a very interesting report. But Professor Kim did not refer to the trade or external investment. In other words, international aspect of economy was not really touched upon in depth. Because critical juncture of Korea, Professor Sem said the three regime changes, colonialization by Japan and integration, and the wartime control economy, and also a new economic restructuring after the liberation. But in Hong Kong, if we try to find critical junctures, I would like to cite the Korean War and reform and opening policy. It was under British colony, and it was a tripod trade hub, transit trade hub. But now it became a financial center and changed the economic structure, focusing on finance. So it kind of did not change from industry to finance. So system change, other than system change, there was a change of government and change of policies and a change of external environment. So I think we might be able to find some other critical junctures from those points of view. That is my question to Professor Kim. And I'm not a historian, but I have a question to Professor KIMIYA. We are talking about the 20th century, but I think the current political situation in Korea is very interesting. And the conservative versus the liberal, and the elderly versus the young. And there seems to be a conflict between the two. In Hong Kong and Taiwan and Korea, there seems to be a commonality among those three countries. And the most impressive expression is in 2014, a sunflower revolution and umbrella revolution in Hong Kong, and also candle movement in Korea, which actually changed the government. So those democratization movement is common currently among three countries. Why does it happen in Hong Kong, Korea, and Taiwan? in Korea, in Hong Kong, we talk about the change of values. We place more values on spiritual aspects rather than physical aspects. People's mindset changed because the middle-aged and elderly people in Hong Kong were brought up when the Hong Kong was experiencing high economic growth. So to be rich was important. But now economy does not grow that much, and younger people do not want to actually have richness, but rather they would like to pursue different values like democracy, freedom, environment, and fairness. So those are the background of this generational conflict in Hong Kong. While aging and the stagnant economic growth are, of course, common in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Korea, and we can explain this with this, but in Japan it's not happening. That's 3 years ago. Anti-Japan-U.S. Security Pact was there, but people say that the Japanese young people are becoming conservative. So what's the difference between Japan and on the one hand and Hong Kong, Korea, Taiwan on the other hand? Or actually age of democratization, democracy. If democracy happened in the last several years and one in other countries more mature, and maybe that explains the difference. And also in Korea, it has to actually have an identity to pursue different values because it's facing North Korea with very autocratic country. So I would like to know the reasons for the generational conflict.
Thank you very much. So that is in comparing with Hong Kong. And I think you indicated the very interesting questions to the two speakers. Now, finally, the final commentator. We have Professor Lu Junchan, Associate Research Fellow, Institute of Taiwan History of Academia Sinica.
Long Chi-chan from the Institute of Taiwan History, the Academia Sinica. It's really my great honor to be able to participate in this very important joint research on the 21st century history of East Asia, focusing on parallel history. And I also learned a great deal, and especially intellectually exciting, learning from my prestigious Japanese and Korean colleagues. Due to the limits of time, I would not be able to go into the details about my book chapter on Taiwan, but I would try to offer some contrasting points based on the excellent presentation by Professor Kim and Professor KIMIYA. From the Professor Kim's presentation, he actually used a macroeconomic statistic analysis to outline some of the very important long-term trend, economic and demographic trends in East Asian economic development. And Professor KIMIYA actually outlined very succinctly and successfully about the state building experience in South Korea, and also focusing on what he called the entrepreneurial state, and also the concept of regime competition. So with these two key issues in mind, which is also these two issues also the major text of this joint project, namely one is the historical trajectory of state building, and the second is looking at the significance of each region in terms of from a comparative perspective. I will try to outline some of the experiences from my limited knowledge about the history of Taiwan. So as Professor KURATA just pointed out, although Taiwan is also among the four major so-called new industrial economies, NICs, but her experience is actually very different from South Korea, which is a dynastic tradition and also a very civilizational, with a great civilizational tradition. And Taiwan is also different from Hong Kong and Singapore in that it's actually a part of a Japanese colonialism and not from the British experience. And also, it's not a city-state. So therefore, in discussing the history of state building in Taiwan, we're actually not talking about one national history or one area history. It's actually a combination of 4 different kinds of historiography or 4 different kinds of perspective. Namely, the first, the history of the Republic of China in Taiwan. As Professor Kawashima just pointed out this in the morning, how KMT has transformed from or learned from its tobacco in mainland China and transformed itself into a very successful democracy, although it's in the late 80s in Taiwan. That is part of the story of the Taiwan state building efforts. But this is not the only story, because Taiwan is also influenced greatly by the Japanese colonial rule, the 50 years of Japanese colonial rule. So we also need to evaluate the legacy of Japanese colonial modernization in the context of East Asian history. And Taiwan is also an immigrant frontier of Han Chinese, and is also inhabited by indigenous people. So the question of ethnic relations or so-called nationalism is also part of the story. And last but not least, Taiwan is, although it's still isolated in terms of international relations, but it's actually its history, development of its history, especially the post-war period, is closely related to the geopolitical history of East Asia, especially the influence of the United States and its allies, and its relationships with interaction with Japan and China. So with this framework in mind, we can now take a longer look, a long-term historical perspective about the state building experience in Taiwan, starting from the maritime self-strengthening efforts of the late Qing Empire in late 1870s, and also the colonial modernization of Japanese in the 1890s, and also the wartime mobilization of Japanese Empire in the 1940s. And also with this background in mind, we can then pursue to look again and examine some of the major events in the post-war Taiwan development. For example, the takeover of KMT and ROC regimes in the 1940s, and the outbreak of the 227 incidents in 1947, and the outbreak of the Korean War and the impact of U.S. military economic aid to the Chiang Kai-shek regimes in the formation of the so-called Cold War system, as outlined by Professor Tanaka in the morning. And also the important economic development starting from 1960s, from import substitution to export orientation, and to the infrastructure building in the 1970s, and also the development of high tech starting from 1980s all the way until today. And also there's important development in terms of diplomatic realms, when the Taiwan or the so-called ROC suffered diplomatic defeat in the United Nations, and followed by the establishment of formal diplomatic tie between Japan and the United States with the PRC, People's Republic of China. That led to the so-called Taiwanization of KMT regimes and initiated the trends of so-called indigenization and also the democratization process that led to the lifting of martial law by the late President Chiang Ching-kuo in 1987. And with this landmark event, we can now witness a new stage or a different stage of the so-called state building in post-war Taiwan under the leadership of the President Li Denghui, and then witness the first direct presidential election in 1996, all the way to the regime change in 2000, the year 2000, when the first DPP President Chen Shui-bian get elected. All the way until today, there's actually 2 regime changes followed, exemplified by the election of President Ma Ying-jeou in 2008, and also the President Tsai Ing-wen in 2016. So how can we? How does this story of Taiwan's so-called state building tell us about the state building efforts in East Asia in general? I think there are actually 4 major issues that are worth noting. The first is the so-called state building and the relationship between democratization. And we actually witnessed Taiwan was considered the only, if not the first, the fully democratic society of the so-called Chinese. And the experience of the transition from a so-called hard authoritarian rule to a soft authoritarian rule, to the democratic transition, and all the way to the democratic consolidation, or it becomes the key issues in post-war Taiwan's history. So the second issue is the importance or the relation between state building and economic development. Taiwan was considered a successful example in post-war economic takeoff, and it was credited that this kind of development was not a kind of a random development. It's actually initiated by a group of industrial bureaucrats, highly educated. Most of them are engineers, and with a high sense of patriotic emotions, and they were able to design a system or institution for industrial development and respond to the change of global regional markets. But this development forms an important contrast to the development, for example, in South Korea. And the third realm for comparison is, as Professor KURATA just mentioned, is the emergence of civil society, starting from late 1970s and become flourished in the in 1980s and all the way until today. We witnessed the important social movement from farmers to students to so-called LGBT in recent years. And this is also very unique in terms of social movement or the development of civil society in East Asian regions. And finally, there's also a controversial realms of so-called international relations or the problem of statehood or sovereignty. Especially with the rise of China in the 1990s and all the way until today, the question of Taiwan's statehood and sovereignty, or its so-called diplomatic relation or international organization, become more and more difficult, if not challenging. So these four different realms, I think, all constitute a very interesting, if not important, point of contrast between Taiwan, South Korea, and maybe Hong Kong and Singapore as well, in terms of democratization, economic development, civil society, and international relations. So by way of conclusion, I would also emphasize the ongoing challenge of Taiwan today, namely the ongoing debate about national identity. The first thing, we have two different kinds of nationalism in competition, from the state level election to the local level election to the everyday life of the Taiwanese. And also this also affects the interaction between Taiwan and China, or Taiwanese and Chinese. And the second challenge is the so-called governability or governmentality, how to restructure the state apparatus to make it become more efficient or more responsive to the ongoing challenges. And there is also, as Professor KIMIYA and Professor KURATA just mentioned, we also facing some general issues. For example, the welfare, how to build a welfare state, and how to face the environmental crisis, and also there's a universal question about human rights and everything. So these are common challenges, not only in Taiwan but also in East Asia and the world as well. So to conclude, I think facing a new age of uncertainty, I think the state building experience in Taiwan not only is important or interesting in itself, but it also can offer some contrasting examples for our East Asian neighbors and countries. And I look forward to the continued exchange and collaboration between our projects, and also hopefully our collective efforts will make contribution to this society in the 21st century. Thank you very much for your attention.
Professor Chang, thank you very much indeed. he has covered a variety of issues and also comparisons, democracy, the state building, the issues concerning elite, the civil society issues, and also the international relations and also the sovereignty issues. All these issues have been covered, and the comparison of experiences of countries in the region is very important. I agree. And also the challenges the Taiwanese society faced with is common in many other countries as well. So based on these two people's comments, we'd like to get within 5 minutes responses from the two speakers first. Thank you very much for your comment. Professor Kurata gave me direct questions to my presentation, and so let me respond to that. Over the last 100 years of history, as I look at the South Korea, I think there are three critical junctures, and that's the period of colony and the wartime period and the divided nation period, the after liberalization. So the regime change, I focused on regime change, but even before regime change, I think more or less, I think you may be able to identify other critical junctures. After the war, with the Japan ROK treaty, the economic relationship recovered, and the trade also came about, and also the economic development was spurred by the Korean War, and also during the oil crisis at that time, in order to overcome the trigger for overcoming that is the various construction projects in the Middle East. This was also very important, and also there were other crises. But of course, I can't deal with each of these. But in my paper, the industrial policy, I believe I can touch upon those things in connection with the industrial policy. So in Mr. KIMIYA's presentation, I think these were very important points. For example, the South Korea, so inclusive industrialization happened, and the export-oriented, there was a transition into export orientation. How was it achieved? And there may be a lot of debate about it, but the Japan ROK treaty was perhaps a trigger, and also Vietnam War was another trigger. So I think my presentation had to do with Professor KIMIYA's presentation. So I think this may be interdependent or. So thank you very much for the questions. First, to Professor Kurata's comment. Of course, in a way, post-materialism is one aspect that cannot be rejected. But in the case of South Korea, rather than new values, the values that were thought to be shared were, in fact, there's a big difference between the reality and the thinking on the part of the young. Well, I was impressed that during the candor demonstration, the slogan that was heard most often is, "Can you call this a state?" So in other words, a state is supposed to be more decent, but the state under Park Geun-hye administration was not anything that can be called a state. So that's the kind of slogan that hit me struck me a great deal. So in other words, of course, Park Geun-hye administration, though there were people who are supporting Park Geun-hye administration who are doing demonstration as well, and these were conservatives and right-wingers, and so they held the national flag of ROK and did the demonstration. But the state, what is the state? On this question, I think there were some common views, but in reality, the reality of the state was quite different from the shared view of state, and that was the catalyst. And with the candor demonstration, I think that was the greatest catalyst. So in this respect, Professor KURATA said the youth of democracy, how young democracy is. But I would like to divide this issue into two. The first point is, be it South Korea or Taiwan, I'm not sure about Hong Kong, or well, Singapore is pretty far, but through their campaign, democracy was attained, and this experience of success is there. You do some campaign, but people, particularly in Japan, well, no matter what you do, you really can't succeed. That's a kind of sentiment in Japan. That's why the Japanese people really don't try to do any movement or campaign. So this kind of a success experience is here. That's point one. And point number two, as I have been saying, as a result of a democratization, you have a democratic regime. But is this it? People wonder. With the president and the entourage of president, this is a great part of the important policies of the government. Of course, we have to corroborate it, but what is supposed to be a democratic regime was not a democratic regime in reality. So that is the shortness of the history of democracy. Democracy is still immature, and to this aspect, the democratic regime was immature, and from the side of direct democracy, this kind of a complaint was very important. Professor Chan also said what he said. On what he said, Asian needs, or I think we're looking at the issue of state building. So from what viewpoint should we analyze it? I think a very comprehensive bird's eye view was presented by Professor Chang. So the 4 points he made in the case of South Korea, each of these is a very important element for South Korea. And these need to be analyzed. And in my paper, I try to incorporate these, I believe. But if there's any insufficiency, I would like to supplement my statement in my presentation, in my paper. Thank you. Thank you very much. The presenters have been cooperative. We still have 12 minutes left, so thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, people on the floor, we would like to get questions from the floor. So if a microphone is brought to you, please state your name and affiliation before you make your remark. Thank you. I'm a researcher, Minato Ozaki, with the Mitsui Sumitomo Trust Banking. Now, Professor KIMIYA, you pointed out there is a strong morality that is expected from the state in South Korea, and on the other hand, there is an entrepreneurial state orientation. After Kim Dae-jung administration, the liberal people have been pursuing the entrepreneurial state. And I think there are many occasions where they were in conflict with each other. So, of course, it is not easy for us to forecast what would happen to South Korea in the future, but may I invite your views on this? Thank you very much for a very good question. And to the person sitting in front of him, please, Madam Shikata with Mitsui and Company. I have a question to Professor Kim. Now, about the population owners, you touched upon that. But by 2045, there's going to be a singularity. 47% of the jobs will be lost, and the Japanese enterprises are trying to reduce jobs with population owners and the AI. There might be less and less jobs. There may be some conflict. So, what is your view? Secondly, the conglomerates in South Korea. Now, from 1970s, I have been involved with South Korea through trade and investment. And on an unofficial basis, when I talk to my friends in South Korea, they say Korea is a remarkable country. When I was a child, you have to study very hard. When you become an adult, you have to work enormously hard, but you're not rewarded very much. Those people who are employed by the conglomerate chaebol, you enjoy a very good livelihood. That is my impression. What is your view on that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. One more question we will entertain. Mukai is my name. I was a civil servant. I retired already. Today, there was some politics discussed, but mainly economics were discussed. But there's a cultural background which we have to take into consideration. Well, Korea was occupied by Japan for a rather long time, and Hong Kong by Japan for a short time, and a long time by UK. But those three countries, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Korea, I think there was a Confucianism influence for a long period of time. That was very important. Of course, Korea was not directly under Chinese control, though there was some Chinese army came into Korea during the war, and Hong Kong was, of course, under UK rule. But there's I think, difference and similarity of these. So I would like you to touch upon cultural background of the difference and the commonality of those three countries. Any other question? If not, I would like to have response from Professor KIMIYA first. Thank you for valuable question. Yes. The first question, asking for morality from the state and entrepreneurial state, is there any kind of conflict between the two? And did it happen or not? Yes, you're right. But in high economic growth period from 1970s, 80s, up until that time, economic growth of the country was a sort of regarded as a morality. It expressed the morality of the state by high economic growth. I remember quite well, and I read the literature about that. But Korea, the government leads, and chaebol leads economic growth. But asking chaebol to lead the economic growth, but at the same time, there's a criticism against it, and it's deep-rooted. Well, in a capitalist society, of course, monopoly is an issue. there's a sort of relationship with the monopoly and capitalism. But in a capitalist society, large corporations or chaebols lead the economic growth of that country. It's what happens usually. But in Korea, in the high economic growth, there was a strong criticism against the chaebol compared to Japan. So, in principle, there's these two different ideas about entrepreneurial and the morality. But what's going to happen in the future? Moon Jae-in government is trying to create jobs by increasing public investment. Is it sustainable? I don't think so. If that is the case, to create jobs, the government has to depend on enterprises. But up until 1980s, Korean companies were under the leadership of the government, and the government's policy was to nurture chaebols. But right now, Samsung is a typical example. It supersedes the state. It acts and selects, and it doesn't create many jobs inside Korea. And it is criticized for that. So the relationship between the government and the companies have changed. They were complementary in the past, but the companies are now globalized, and the government has difficulty controlling companies. But the government, for public good and welfare, the government has to depend on enterprises. So there seems to be a friction, and this friction might increase in the future. Second, Confucianism. We call it the Confucian capitalism. Some people say that. Some people say Confucianist democracy. That's the word some people use. Confucianism had a positive effect on democratization and economic growth. Some people have that view. But Japan is, whether we can call it the Confucius country or not, there's a question mark about Japan. Yes, the Korean Peninsula, compared to China and compared to Japan, it has a strong influence of Confucianism. Having said so, up until 1950s, economy did not grow that much, and after 1960s, why there was a rapid growth? As far as I remember, there was interesting debate. Professor Sato and Professor Watanabe had a debate on this. Professor Sato said Confucianist values were discarded and overcome, and that is why economic growth was achieved. And Toshiro Watanabe says because of the Confucianist ideas, economic growth was successful. I think cultural background is important, but why economic growth was good in certain times and bad in certain times, that's difficult to really... Professor Kim, I think you have a lot to say, but please be succinct. Thank you very much for your question, Professor Shikata. Korea will face population onus, though it enjoyed the bonus in the past. And because of the population bonus, there was an rapid economic growth. Maybe 1/3 of the reason of economic growth was because of this bonus. But now we have to face headwind from now on. So the situation will be difficult in the future. For example, social security, we have a short history. So there will be the poverty issue of the elderly. And I think it will be quite challenging. And chaebol is criticized. But Koreans expect their children to work for chaebols. So there's a political aspect to this criticism of chaebol. At the time of rapid economic growth, chaebol led economic growth spread to the bottom of the society. And it spread to the entire society, percolated. But because of the low growth period of recent times, number of jobs decreased, and though there's a growth, there's no increase of jobs, and economic inequality and disparity is increasing. But in case of Japan, since 1970s, Japan is in a low growth period, but economic disparity did not increase. But in case of Korea, disparity increased at the same time as low growth period. That is why the situation is dire in case of Korea, and it is a difficult issue.
So 30 seconds each for the two of you. Well, whether the cultural theory can explain the reality, I think politically the cultural theory will be utilized, and perhaps it will become more important. In other words, going back to tradition, Xi Jinping is talking about the revival of China, and so in East Asia, creative community might be arising, and then Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea, Japan. How are the surrounding countries going to respond? Perhaps there will be some issues.
China is in Taiwan. One is the Chinese local tradition coming with the Han Chinese immigrant in the 17th and 18th century. And there is a mainland, so-called mainland Chinese civilization and their cultures coming with the KMT regimes in 1949. And there is the ongoing impact of the so-called New China impact starting from the cross-strait interaction from 1987. So there's three different impact of Chinese factors. So we need to look at both historical and regional factors. Thank you very much.
ありがとうございました。いよいよ議論が面白くなってきたところで、
Well, it's been coming really interesting, but I had to make you rush. In other words, the issue of values and the state building in thinking about characteristics is a factor that cannot be ignored, and I renewed my impression of this. The four speakers, each of them were very concise and very clear in stating their issues. I thought that this session was of quite a high level, and therefore I hope that you will give a warm hand to all the speakers. Thank you very much. And so we end this part 2 session. And thank you very much to all the panelists. And we will take a 10-minute break and resume at 2:40 or so with part 3.